Okay, let me share. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, perfect. And I will keep an eye on the chat in case anyone has any comments as I go. And I would love to hear from y'all, even if you want to unmute your mic, if you've had any interactions with folks who identify with this movement in your work. I'll be talking a bit about, how I've interacted with folks who identify as sovereign citizens or have that kind of belief system in my work. And then, yeah, I would just love if y'all have any input, and I'll try to keep an eye on the chat. So yeah, thank you again for having me. I think I last presented about a year ago, so I'm really happy to be back. I am a professor in forensic psychology at UNM. We're kind of creating this new forensic division over there, which is great. And a little bit of my work has to do with, like I said, doing some pre-hire psych evaluations for folks applying to law enforcement positions. But the majority of my work and why I interact with sovereign citizens is I do a lot of pre-trial forensic evaluations for folks involved in the legal system. So a lot of that involves competence to stand trial evaluation. So is the defendant able to understand with a reasonable degree their charges against them? Are they able to work with their attorney, or do they have any kind of mental health or other issue getting in the way of them doing so? So for those reasons, I often see some folks who might have, extremist beliefs or appear to be a little mentally ill in some way. And some of these include sovereign citizens. So I'll talk a bit about my work and then also how they present in custody settings from arrest to all the way to their trials. So what is a sovereign citizen for folks who might not be so familiar? I found a few different definitions. And one of these is, they're a loosely affiliated group of individuals. There's not a huge group cohesion going on with sovereign citizens, but they often have this primary belief that the US government is illegitimate. And for those reasons, they are really immune to any laws or governance by our government. So they really think they're above the law and they're not subject to the law. But another interesting point is that they still claim to have all the rights afforded by the Constitution. They're just not, they don't believe themselves to be subject to any kind of governance or law that would result in their detention or incarceration. And mainly they oppose taxation. So they don't believe that they should be subject to pay any kind of taxes. And that's often how they enter the criminal justice system because of tax fraud or other kind of issues. And interestingly, they tend to be grouped under right-wing extremism, but there's actually a lot of different flavors of and offshoots of sovereign citizenship altogether. So really what unites them is this anti-governmental anarchist views. And so I don't know, when I typically think of right wing, I think of people who still sort of believe in the government, but their particular government. And these folks tend to be a kind of a different flavor altogether. But again, there are a lot of variations, which we will talk about. And here's a definition from the FBI. So this is how they define a sovereign citizen: individuals who openly reject their US citizenship status, believe that most forms of established government authority and institutions are illegitimate, and seek wholly or in part through unlawful acts of force or violence to further their claim to be immune from government authority. This part is important. So the mere advocacy of political or social positions, political activism, use of strong rhetoric, or generalized philosophic embrace of violent tactics may not constitute extremism and may be constitutionally protected. So they differentiate quite a bit between those who are in favor of violence versus those who actually commit violence in furtherance of their ideology. And then Homeland Security is a bit narrower, their definition, and focuses on the sovereign citizen extremists. So again, really highlighting that there's a range of individuals who believe in these types of ideologies. So groups or individuals who facilitate or engage in acts of violence directed at public officials, financial institutions, and government facilities in support of their belief that the legitimacy of the US citizenship should be rejected. Almost all forms of established government authority and institutions are illegitimate, and that they are immune from federal, state, and local laws. And then, kind of in my field, a psychologist, I believe she's a psychologist, Christine Sarteschi, and I'm probably definitely butchering that name, but really looks at sovereign citizens as any individual who legally considered to be a citizen of the US and who simultaneously believes that the US is not a legitimate government, and as a result of that illegitimacy, believes themselves to be immune to all US laws. So under that, that's considered a sovereign citizen. But with all these different definitions, the core factor is really that these individuals proclaim the American government is illegitimate. So let's talk a bit about the history of the movement. And this won't be very in depth, but I did want to give just a little bit of context. So what we know is that very few people were aware of this group prior to 2010. And it's really gained some traction in recent years, and particularly now with the political climate. But it originated in the 1960s and 1970s, really as a result of this anti-tax movement. And it grew to challenging the legitimacy of government itself. And it did originate, from what I've found, it originated out of, white supremacy and anti-Semitic beliefs and values. And then again, some of these offshoots have tailored themselves to different sort of ethnic groups or ideologies, which we'll talk about. Another instigator of the movement was the American farm crisis. So kind of the agricultural recession, and that some of these sovereign citizens were offering these fraudulent debt relief programs. And really kind of in times of debt and financial crises is when people start to question and maybe become a bit radicalized in their beliefs that government is against us and that they should not be subject to their laws. So current estimates actually, are they against all taxes or just federal? That's a really good question. I know that there's a big focus of the movement on the federal system, because they call themselves like anti-federalists, and those who do abide by or accept or adopt some of the federal laws are like federalists themselves. So I do think primarily it's against the federal government. But that's a very good question, and I want to look into it now. Well, we'll move on, and I'll see if anything kind of addresses that. But current estimates are, and this was actually from around like 2018-ish, that it's about 300,000 to 500,000 self-proclaimed sovereign citizens to date in the US. And research as recent as 2021 actually showed that it's present in 26 different countries. And I would be very interested. I haven't seen anything on this recently. Maybe I can come back and do a part 2 on how COVID-19 mask mandates, vaccines, et cetera, has influenced the movement. And I wonder if there's kind of an offshoot faction with that. So that's kind of where we're at now with sovereign citizens in the US. So what are the features of sovereign citizens? Well, we know that they tend to be white and middle-aged or older. However, of interest is that the fastest growing subpopulation is Black or African American, and that's been since the 1990s. So there's the offshoots, kind of like the Moorish law, is what they call themselves. And again, people have their different reasons for opposing government, and there's been a lot of interesting research about Black and African American individuals who have their own reasons for being against the US government, and it stems more from kind of oppression at the systemic level rather than, for other folks, it could be more just this taxation and without representation as they believe. And so this, I would love to hear from y'all in the chat for those who have interacted with sovereign citizens, perhaps on the field or whatnot. But really, from my work and then what I've seen in terms of watching videos online, they tend to kind of show up with this pseudo intellectual and pseudo legal speech. There's a lot of interrupting if you're trying to explain the law to them or different legal concepts. There's a lot of circular reasoning, so talking in circles and kind of justifying their beliefs with very esoteric or like fringe laws. And it really doesn't make very much sense. But there is a lot of this kind of tactic where they really try to interrupt or stop any sort of argument with their own particular type of logic. There's a lot of monologuing. So these long, drawn out kind of, I picture, Charlie Day from Always Sunny with that cork board and pictures and all the strings connecting different ideas where it just doesn't make a lot of sense. And it's very kind of conspiracy oriented. And they can really have kind of odd, bizarre, confusing speech and behavior, can be pretty disorganized. So you can't really make sense of their thoughts or where they're going. But really, they kind of come on very strong and are combative and confrontational with the interruptions, et cetera. So high level of defensiveness, guardedness, lack of cooperation. I see that in my interview settings, and I definitely have seen that in videos where law enforcement is attempting to arrest or detain individuals who, identify as free inhabitants or sovereign citizens or whatever kind of language they tend to use. So I'm gonna give, 1 minute if anyone wants to jump in and talk about anything they've noticed, if they've ever worked with someone with these beliefs or any particular situation.
Hey, this is Ben with APD. I had an encounter with a sovereign citizen on a traffic stop. And the first thing I noticed when I was walking up is they had probably 6 or 7 "Don't tread on me" stickers on the back of their vehicle. And so I walked up and they had their window rolled down like maybe an inch. And, I explained why I stopped them and I needed their identification. And they explained to me that they weren't driving, they were traveling. And there was some distinction there that I couldn't quite wrap my head around, but in their mind, there was some distinction. And, it kind of went back and forth with all of these bullet points that you're saying. They were interrupting me and using some of this circular talk. At one point, they asked for a sheriff's deputy, who they said did have authority, but myself as a city police officer did not. And it went on, and it ended up being a very violent situation before we were able to get this person in custody. And
Mhm.
that always kind of sticks out of my mind is the confrontation I had with the sovereign citizen.
Thank you so much for mentioning that, because I'm going to hit on all those points that it tends to be a pretty neutral sort of traffic stop, routine interaction with folks that turns really combative pretty quickly. And there are those signs that you can tell, like that language traveling. So we have a comment: traveling individuals who reside in their vehicle tend to park on around campus. Yep, cooperative until you mention no license plates or driver's license. Asking for any type of identification is usually kind of a trigger, or folks will have their own self-made identification cards and things like that. But yeah, that's one of the kind of lingo or phrases they use where they're not driving, they're traveling, they're moving within the land. And I think that's kind of how they justify things. And that's interesting. So they do respect sheriff's deputies because sheriff is an elected official by the people and they recognize their legitimacy. Is that what you said, Detective Melendrez, that they recognize the sheriffs? They said
Yeah, I didn't know exactly why. Detective Carter, he explained it there, but they did ask several times for a sheriff's deputy, and it makes sense that they recognize them as legitimate since it's an
Mhm.
elected position.
Oh, that's so interesting. Thank y'all for sharing your experiences. Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit about how, they present really in those situations. So I have a few examples here. I wonder if y'all, I mean, I really was into the Brooks trial, mainly because he had gone through a few different competency evaluations because of his behavior and his beliefs. But I really think he's like the quintessential sovereign citizen, with some of the arguments he was making, representing himself, a lot of monologuing, interruption. It was obvious he had no real grasp of the law, but he was trying to use these kind of strange fringe laws and arguments. Yeah, so right, so I think the judge handled that nicely, but you can just see what a burden it puts on the criminal justice system when you have a sovereign citizen like in your courtroom. So he was a great example. I've got a couple other people here that have at least tried to use sovereign citizenship as a defense strategy. So to the left of, or I mean, sorry, to the right of Darrell Brooks, we have Terry Nichols, who was involved in the Oklahoma City bombing. He had sovereign citizen beliefs, at least some sort of faction or offshoot. And then we have Christopher Boone Lacey, killed a California Highway Patrol officer, and also had some sovereign citizen beliefs. Below him, I have never heard of this person, but I thought his story was interesting. This is Adrian or Sache. I'm totally gonna butcher that, but he had declared his property. I believe this was in Canada. I might be wrong. He had declared his property an independent state. When police tried to evict him from his independent state, he attempted to kill them. 2 months later, one of his followers shot at police as they attempted to remove his weapons. And again, it was a very kind of dangerous situation for law enforcement to be in. They were particularly targeted when trying to carry out their work. And then I don't know if this is, I mean, we know the infamous Jared Fogle, Subway sandwich guy. He actually tried to use sovereign citizenship as a defense. I think his charge was either receipt, possession, distribution of child pornography. So, people try to use this defense quite often, and it's really never successful. Let me read the chat. Detective Carter. Oh, wait, no, you already. Oh, wait. I have a friend who had a confrontation with the sovereign after the encounter, which ended the arrest. Sovereign launched a campaign of claim. Yep, exactly. So we'll talk about just how much, again, they burden the criminal justice system with these like frivolous claims, and how much that can really stress out the people that have any interaction with them. I've had colleagues doing forensic evaluations with sovereign citizens, and they get letter after letter filed with the court that is kind of threatening them, and it's just not pleasant at all. I know law enforcement, y'all deal with this often, but this kind of goes to a new level because it's just constant harassment, or it can be. So we already talked about the rates of sovereign citizens in the US, and even though estimates have put it at about 2% of inmates as ascribing to the sovereign citizen movement, they're often like overrepresented just because of how much, like, given how many there are in the US, that's an overrepresentation because their behavior leads to custody often, because they're so combative and don't comply with the law. And they're often referred for mental health evaluations. So their attorney, will meet with them and say, I don't know what this person is talking about. They're clearly delusional. Their speech is nonsensical. And so we get those referrals quite a bit. And, they employ a number of tactics, and there's actually, the internet is a huge facilitator of sovereign citizen beliefs. There's Reddit, there's 4chan, there's YouTube, and other kind of online seminars on how to use these arguments to skirt justice, but not once has it ever been successful in terms of a defense strategy. But that's also interesting when we talk about sovereign citizens in correctional settings, is that because you're in this isolated sort of vacuum, word of those types of tactics and strategies and ideologies moves quickly, and it spreads very quickly, word of mouth, in correctional settings, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, so, okay, let's see. Are the claims and letters done just to be a menace, or do they feel their claims are legitimate? That's a great question. I do think both, but I do think those who are very committed to the movement and the ideology do think they are legitimate. Um, and their whole sort of MO is to look for loopholes in the law, to use these kind of straw man arguments so that their legal persona is different from their physical persona. So it's a total ideology. And so I think people that are much more committed to it, um, definitely think that they could be successful. I also think there's an aspect of kind of trying to frustrate justice or delay things and kind of be I think it's a little bit of both, but I do think those who are very entrenched in the beliefs definitely think they're legitimate and might be successful. Thanks for the questions. So sovereign citizens, as Detective Melendrez was saying, they can really pose a unique and significant threat to law enforcement at traffic stops in particular, because things can escalate so quickly and they are so reluctant to follow basic traffic and other vehicle laws, even reluctant to follow, the standards we have in the state for like vehicle registration and things like that. They can be argumentative, combative, and uncooperative in traffic situations, and they do tend to use conflict-oriented tactics. So whether that's verbal, um, demanding officers to prove jurisdiction, that's another kind of term or phrase you might hear is, you have no jurisdiction. What's your jurisdiction? Or saying they're traveling, or saying they're a free inhabitant and they can move freely wherever they want. They may refuse to answer questions. They may repeat themselves over and over, which can just get very aggravating in general. And they will insist over and over they do not consent. They do not consent to any law enforcement actions being taken. They may also, like folks have mentioned, try to ask for your supervisor, or ask for like sheriffs or, elected officials, etc. These can be very prolonged interactions that'll test your de-escalation abilities. And there actually are groups online that really advocate. I did a little Reddit search, which now, I don't know, I hope I don't get any spam related to that, but trying to advocate for confusing or befuddling police. So here are some tactics that you can use against police to confuse them and kind of trap them into your argument or whatnot. But as I'll talk about, there are actually some counter argument websites from law enforcement or prior law enforcement individuals that kind of talk about rebuttals to their arguments that can be successful. And I can share that out to y'all too if you're interested. Okay, I don't want to kind of belabor this point, but we don't really know how much and under what circumstances these interactions can be hazardous, but it sounds like y'all have had some experiences. You can draw on that for sure. So some are extremists who are armed and willing to use deadly violence, and others are just, kind of want to be a menace, and they might just want to argue and just have negative views of law enforcement in particular. But it's interesting, if you're ever going to the home of someone that might have these beliefs, because it is such kind of a shared ideology and it spreads very quickly, family members and close others will typically have those views too. So just, keep an eye on that. Circumstances vary. So traffic stops, ambushes, that's very rare, but there was one case I talked about, or I read about, where an individual kind of enticed or requested some police presence at their house, and it was a sort of ambush situation, like a booby trapped kind of environment. Rare, but it has happened. Standoffs might be more likely to happen when you're dealing with someone with these types of beliefs. And it can happen with routine checks and warrant serving, especially with warrant serving. That really indicates that someone's not following the stipulations on their probation, or they're not following whatever kind of guidelines, if they were supposed to be in court and whatever. So that could be kind of a trigger, like, hey, maybe I should look into this a bit or have this in the back of my mind. Like we said, most often they begin as routine traffic stops and they're escalated. Yeah. what kind of crimes do they usually commit? So because they're anti-tax, there are a lot of like fraud and financial crimes, tax evasion, etc. And so what this is called, these frivolous motions that we've been talking about, is actually called paper terrorism. So it's again just this constant onslaught, constant harassment via motions to the court, letters to attorneys, letters to judges, and they can be really alarming because they tend to be pretty disorganized and nonsensical and have a threatening undertone. They're often very confident in their legal knowledge, although they cite things that don't make sense. There's a lot of citing of released on recognizance or speedy trial violations, things like that, that they tend to cite. And let's see, what else? Failure to abide by codes and policies. So they believe they have special privileges and they don't have to abide by like probation stipulations, etc. And it can be violent acts as well. So it really can be anything. So I talked a little bit about this, but it can be spread through word of mouth transmission in jails and prisons. That's why that can really be kind of a breeding ground, petri dish of these people getting these beliefs. You know, I've worked with some folks who get referred and they're like, you know, I think I'm going to do this strategy because I heard it from my cellie or whatever. And, you know, they engage in a lot of efforts to hinder proceedings by asserting their beliefs. As we talked about, like with the Darrell Brooks trial, that was just a perfect example. And some of the issues they might raise in court is that the court lacks jurisdiction. They might cite these kind of oaths of office or common law, admiralty law, Uniform Commercial Code, the 14th Amendment, income tax. And then they often, this one's kind of interesting. If a flag has fringe on it, they'll say that that represents a kind of free land or where the Constitution doesn't apply. So I don't totally understand that one very well, but the fringe on flags is a big kind of piece of language that they'll use a lot to justify their immunity from law. Okay, so what are some of the perspectives of law enforcement officers? So interestingly, intelligence officers specifically, but I think other kind of law enforcement officers, you know, have actually considered sovereign citizens as the top domestic terrorist threat. So above, you know, extremists, neo-Nazis, Islamic extremists, they've rated sovereign citizens as the most concerning. Are the Black Israelites another offshoot of the sovereign movement? I believe so. That sounds familiar. And at the end of this, I'm going to do a quick Google search and look that up. I did have a list of some other kind of offshoots. There's a lot of like, okay, the Black Panther. Okay, so some overlap with philosophies, including the Black Panther Party, Scientology, anti-vaccination, doomsday preppers can be considered offshoots of sovereign citizens. But oftentimes there is some overlap with like militia and other groups like that. So thanks, that's interesting. And I'm going to look into that. But some other perspectives is that, you know, some folks have really regarded sovereign citizens as overall law-abiding citizens that are kind of misinformed about the law, with a small proportion that have the propensity for violence. So it sounds like perhaps y'all have had some less than, you know, some pretty normal or routine interactions with them. There's just a little bit of argument going on. And then other kind of forums and websites have really called sovereign citizens the bane of existence of law enforcement officers, just that there is all this arguing and like, they're just tough to deal with. There's a lot of resistance and that makes your job tough. But like I said, there are these websites and sources for handling interactions with sovereign citizens that might be useful, and I'd be happy to share. I think I just did a quick Google search and they came up. So that's good. There's some resistance or counter resistance, I guess. Okay, let me talk a little bit about my role just real quickly, but because they have this rigid ideology, because they're so inflexible in their beliefs, a lot of times attorneys or other folks will refer them for jail-based mental health evaluations. But actually, research shows that the vast majority of sovereign citizens are not mentally ill and they are competent to stand trial. If they have some sort of other mental illness going on, it tends to be pretty separate from the sovereign citizen beliefs. But that's really because their behavior kind of defies what we know as diagnostic categories. It can appear delusional up front, and I'll talk about that. Really the biggest rule out that I look for is, does this person have a delusional disorder? Um, or do they have schizophrenia, which is kind of delusions plus hallucinations? And if those aren't present, then we have to determine whether it's a delusion or it's this extreme belief. And that's really, a hot topic in my field right now, is differentiating between delusions and extreme beliefs. I don't know if y'all know about gang stalking or have worked with, gang stalking in a way, but that's another area where kind of have to figure out, do they have these other features that make it veer into the delusional realm, or are they just kind of having this belief they're very committed to that is still kind of a little bit flexible, or doesn't reflect a mental illness. So our definition of delusion is fixed beliefs that are not amenable to change in light of conflicting evidence. So it really comes down again to the flexibility of the belief. If you challenge them, do they give a little bit? Can they consider that this could not be the truth, or this might not be the way? And if they have any bizarre components that can help you kind of distinguish, or help me distinguish if it's a delusion. So if they are also like, oh yeah, and they implanted a chip in my brain and now I get messages from Jennifer Lopez or something like that, then I'm like, okay, that probably, is more in the delusional side of things. But the other thing is that our diagnostic manual says that if it's a shared belief system, it cannot be a delusion. So they're kind of eliminating religion here. And so for us, that gets really tricky, because we're like, there are these kind of shared belief systems like sovereign citizenship, like gang stalking, that could be more delusional, but do we automatically exclude that as a delusion if other people have the same belief? So it gets a little tricky on my end doing some of this, but I'm kind of trying to keep an eye on time. I don't want to go too over. But just talking about risk for negative interactions with sovereign citizens, from all of our perspective, but law enforcement in particular. So, keeping an eye out, do they have a history of charges related to the ideology or beliefs, like fraud, tax evasion, or violation of court orders? And, not that that can always mean, if you see that criminal history, that you're going to deal with a sovereign citizen, but it could, fly a little flag in your mind that might be the case, or it could be. And, folks that violate even the most minor laws might indicate a disregard for the system at large and governance at large. And again, routine traffic stops or warrant serving really present the greatest risk. And they, rarely are there these elaborate plans that would set off alarm bells, like a booby trapping type of thing. But it starts from the routine kind of field work. And real quick, this is a very interesting kind of assessment, kind of an instrument that we use as forensic psychologists, and it comes out of threat assessment literature. But, having these, there are some signs and background and warning behaviors that could lead a sovereign citizen in particular to commit acts of violence. And this new measure, the TRAP 18, it's called, has actually successfully in research distinguished between sovereign citizens who were violent from those who were not. And so some of these factors in terms of the psychosocial or the background factors can be, they feel morally outraged, or they have a grievance against some major group or the government. They're framed by or entrenched by in this ideology. They have a failure to affiliate with others. They depend on a virtual community. Their occupational goals or successes have been thwarted for some reason, and they blame others for it. Any kind of changes in thinking or emotion can be a factor, and that's something I kind of pay attention to if I'm working with someone consistently. Failure to have any sexually intimate pair bonding, that can be a risk, for kind of this threat assessment, violence, having a mental disorder, and having a history of criminal violence. Some of the warning behaviors can be, they're fixated on a cause, they identify with previous attackers, they have been engaging in novel, aggressive behaviors, they feel like violence is their only option, etc. So it's a pretty interesting measure. I can send it out if folks are interested in it, and it really looks at how these risk factors can lead someone to violence. Okay, so where do we go from here? So, in all of our work, we just gotta, pay attention to risk factors, but particularly those y'all or folks that you work with, your subordinates who are out in the field. It's just real important to pay attention to some of the risk factors. So the bumper stickers or the word traveling, some of that stuff, staying vigilant when you hear those signs. And some strategies have been suggested to manage the sovereign citizenship movement in custody and justice settings. So, some people are like, if we have effective punishment, we can deter the crime. And right now, some of like filing frivolous motions, I think it's like a misdemeanor if even, but really they've tried to support increasing the rate of crime for doing those types of things, or kind of thwarting justice in a trial setting in order to deter the behavior. And incarceration, but is that counterproductive? If we put people in jail for these behaviors, do they start to spread the word to other inmates? And does it become kind of a big mess? And so other experts have talked about, it's best to separate when you have people who have this extremist ideology, and soft solutions. So educating folks, providing kind of advocacy, those have also been put forth as possible solutions to get a handle on this issue. All right, that is where I will be done, but I'd be happy to answer any questions if I can help, or if I do know the answer. That is my email if y'all want to reach out or you have any other questions or comments. And yeah, I hope I did okay on time. I hope I'm not totally over.
Time looks great. This is Ben again. I actually did have a question. On
Yeah.
that last study, it said it had been successful in determining violence with the sovereign citizens. You know what they considered a success?
Yeah, so I think there was a significant effect in terms of them being able to differentiate scores on the TRAP 18. So they took probably, a big pool of those who identify as sovereign citizens, rated them on the TRAP 18, and those sovereign citizens who ended up engaging in violence scored much higher on the TRAP 18 than those sovereign citizens who were like relatively harmless. So I'm not totally sure like the effect size or how strong that effect was, but I will look and I can also share it out with y'all, but it seems as though it was successful in terms of differentiating those two groups, which is exciting in my field because we definitely do a lot of the risk assessment, risk instrument stuff. And sometimes it's hard to predict violence, but hopefully we're getting better at it. I know the data
Awesome.
isn't in yet, but with the polarizing politics, I know, I totally think so, because first of all, the financial situation, inflation, financial situation is not great right now. I think that historically has been a catalyst for kind of anti-government movement going on. And I think the political climate is so tense. I don't want to get into a discussion of politics, or do I? But yeah, I think that absolutely will create sovereign citizenship, an increase. And especially too, just with the mask mandates, anytime there's like extra government control, I think people really freak out and might, find themselves on a message board or whatever on Reddit, etc., where they find like-minded people and they get more and more into these views.
Any other questions for Dr. Hamilton?
How do these thought processes begin? How do they recruit? Seems to be a lot of contradictions. Seems how someone could believe this. Honestly, okay, if y'all have any time and want to go on Reddit, you'll see, I mean, there are these like internet sub forums. It's kind of like the dark side of the internet, I think. But, people are, well, actually, I did a talk on this with gang stalking. It really starts with people who are very isolated, may feel like they're not connected with others, maybe a little like socially awkward and such, go online, want both, they identify with the views and they like having in the community of people to talk with and go to and kind of having a cause. Um, how do they recruit? Again, it's a lot of like, yeah, online forum or these word of mouth in jails. That's a huge one, especially if they think it can get them out of trouble. So yeah, I think the internet really kind of, we all know the internet is the worst, but I think it's just, really a place where people can find community with these issues. But yeah, thank you all for the questions. I really appreciate it. Oh, you said mental illness is rare in this group, but has there been studies looking into the impact of this ideology on those with mental illness? Okay, that is very interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that because, and it's Dr. Gonzalez, I think. So in terms of, this was a study with competency in particular. So they don't have the type of mental illness, I guess, that would make them incompetent to stand trial. So this is not really people that meet criteria for delusional disorder or schizophrenia, et cetera, like severe mental illness that would make them incompetent. However, it's the jury's out whether they meet criteria for like paranoid personality disorder or some of those more kind of trait-based disorders. So impact of this ideology on those with mental illness. That's and agreed. Like, is it the chicken or the egg? Are there people who are vulnerable and they go to these forums and they're getting this information? Are they vulnerable for some other type of reason? And or I actually want to send y'all my gang stalking talk if you'd be interested, because I talk a little bit about this and how gang stalking in particular develops, because that seems more kind of delusion based than this, which is more kind of political view based. But incel movement, I'm so glad you asked, because actually in April, one of my colleagues is going to come talk to Cit Echo about incels, and I love that too. But yeah, I definitely do think it is. The incel community was born on Reddit, and it's still going strong. So yeah, definitely. This is awesome. I'm glad you guys were into this talk, or it seems like it.
Dr. Hamilton, it's always a pleasure to have you on the meeting. Thanks so much. Very
Thanks.
informative.
Yeah, that was
Appreciate
excellent. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Rosenbaum. Thank
You.
y'all. I'll leave now. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks. For the rest of you, hope you'll stick around. We have our case presentation. I believe it's going to be presented by Lieutenant Sean Frick.